Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 138 of the Veterinary Behaviour Chat podcast. And today's episode is a little bit inspired by one of my cases from last week, where the question of avoidance, so avoiding, not the dog avoiding things, but as part of our treatment plan, avoiding exposure to certain triggers or stimuli, where that was sort of a big piece of the thing we talked about. And I thought I'd do an episode on it because I feel that it is sometimes a really instrumental, important, like crux of the matter piece that we need to talk about and build into our treatment plan, and that doesn't come naturally or sit naturally with many caregivers. And sometimes persuading or helping caregivers see the value of this can be quite tricky or challenging. Now, what do I mean by avoiding? So it would usually fall into like the management M of our S7M's treatment plan would be to allow the pet to not be confronted with the things that they find difficult to deal with. So it's avoidance of things that cause them to perform unwanted behaviors. Now, there can be a million of those, right? Like it could be avoiding other dogs on walks. It could be, not letting people or unfamiliar people come into your home. It could be, creating lots of distance between yourself and children when you're walking your dog outside. It could be blocking up your windows either with blinds or maybe frosted glass stickers to avoid that visual exposure to triggers or stimuli outside. It could be not taking them to cafes if that's what they find difficult. It could be not taking them on walks at all if that's what they find very triggering. And actually, I saw a second case, not last week, but the week before, where that was a really big piece of the puzzle. And I think the reason that this avoidance piece can become so difficult for caregivers to understand is, number one, they feel that, well, we're just avoiding the situation. So we're not actually fixing anything or dealing with it or helping the dog respond differently or causing the dog to respond differently. They don't kind of see the point, or they see it as a bit of a cop out. Well, yeah, we're just avoiding the situation. So obviously he's doing great. And, oftentimes on follow-up, especially on the first follow-up, I'll ask the question, how are we doing? Yeah, he's so much better, but that's obviously because we're avoiding everything. Okay, that's interesting. He's so much better, but it's just because we're avoiding everything. So what most caregivers want is for their pet to be okay in the presence of those things that they find really difficult to deal with. That to them looks like success. It's not, the dog's doing so much better. We haven't had any explosive responses, or we haven't had any barking or high arousal, piloerection, dog pulling on the lead. We haven't had any of that for the past 6 weeks, which essentially are the unwanted behaviors that the dog was presented with. But in their mind, it's only because we're avoiding the situation. So in their mind, the dog should still be responding that way in a calm, happy, non-reactive way, even when they see the triggers. So that's the first thing, is this idea of, well, yeah, he's so much better, but it's just because we're avoiding. And I think the second thing that oftentimes I get a lot of pushback about, well, actually, there are probably two more things. That one would be, we're making their world so small. They're not living a life that they should be living because we are restricting them so much. We're not able to go on walks anymore, or we're only able to go to certain places on walks. They're not allowed to interact with other dogs anymore because that's what they find really difficult. So there's this idea of we're restricting their world, and somehow we're restricting them of the canine experience. Many people will say, but surely they need to socialize with other dogs, when we know that that's a really bad idea for many dogs, and that true socialization only really happens in the socialization period up to 4 months of life, and everything after that is just, in inverted commas, learning. It is in the socialization period as well, of course, but perhaps has a slightly different context. But after that, all social interactions are going to cause that individual to learn something, either a positive thing or a negative thing, or, maybe they remain neutral. So that's the second thing is we're shrinking their world. We're not giving them the canine experience that I think we want them to have. That's what our ideal picture is of having a dog in our life. I'm talking about dogs, but I think, the same applies to cats here as well. And then the final piece, which I think kind of goes together with that sort of second piece, is almost the societal conditioning that happens around dogs should be taken for walks X amount of times per day. Dogs should interact and play with other dogs. That's what they need. And almost the idea, if the caregiver isn't providing that, then they're being bad owners, right? They're being bad dog owners. They're not allowed, they're not taking their dog for enough walks. The dog's not getting enough physical exercise. And again, there are so many nuances to all of those pieces. Maybe that dog really struggles with physical exercise. Maybe they have a musculoskeletal disease that causes them pain, and a lot of exercise actually makes things worse and then worsens behavior. One could talk about that for a whole hour, but those nuances around what society tells us every dog needs versus what an individual in front of us requires, both in terms of their physical health as well as their mental and emotional health, as well as their previous life experiences, their genetics, their epigenetics, their socialization period. In the previous week's episode, in episode 137, I spoke about the idea of interoception, their own internal experience. So I think it can be really dangerous to apply these blanket statements of what society thinks good dog ownership looks like to the individuals, and particularly the individuals that many of us, if we're working in the veterinary behavior space, are presented with, because we're usually presented with the extremes, right? The outliers, the ones that are on the realms of the spectrum, that where we really need to treat them as those individuals and treat them differently a little bit. So I think that's where that kind of pushback around avoidance and management can come from. And I myself have fallen into the trap of, being negotiated with and being compromised with, well, can't we just take him then on one walk per day? Or can't we just do this? Or, and then you start to compromise. And while, yes, that is an important piece of the relationship building with the caregiver and your client, and making sure they stay on board with you and that you're able to help them over a long period of time. At the same time, I have gotten so much better as I've become more experienced and seen more cases at being a lot more declarative in what I think that patient needs for a period of time. And I think here are the dangers with not avoiding when we need to avoid. And I think there are a few. The first one is we want to make sure that if a patient that is struggling with something is exposed to that something, that it's done below threshold, in inverted commas. That means that it's done at a distance or an intensity or in a way where we don't have physiological emotional arousal, whether that's fear, anxiety, frustration, over-arousal of any sort of shape or form, even potentially hyper-excitement, right? And that, I think, can be extremely difficult for many, many caregivers to read and assess properly. So oftentimes, by the time they've realized they were too close, it's already too late. And it's about reading the subtle signs, the subtle pieces of body language. It's about having a plan of how to escape the situation if things don't go well. It's about knowing when to stop. It's about being aware that it's going to take a lot of patience and baby steps, and that you might go one step forward and two steps back again. It really takes a lot of skill, and in my opinion, really requires the assistance and the guidance and potentially the in-person assistance of a really, really experienced trainer who can help the caregiver read the signs. If we're at the stage where we are starting to reintroduce that patient to the world in a controlled way. So that's that whole idea of desensitization and counter conditioning. And I think oftentimes that's gone too far, far too quickly before the patient is even ready to be exposed, re-exposed, and is able to process. And oftentimes I'll hear the sentences of, oh yeah, well, I know I take treats out with me, but he's not able to take the treats for the majority of time, which is a really clear sign, right? That patient is not in the right state to calmly process something. And I think there's also always a little bit this expectation, and I think that's been propagated by media and all the sort of unfortunately really bad examples that we see in the media of what dog training or behavior change should look like. And a really great trainer said to me once, if done correctly, it should look super boring. If we're re-exposing and desensitizing and counter conditioning, it should look super boring, like nothing to be seen here, no dog arousing, and then somehow magically the dog is over, his mind is changed by some magic force or something. It should look really boring. So I think that's the first thing, is if we do expose and we don't avoid, what does that look like? Are the caregivers good enough to do it really well? Or, and this is like where it gets, I guess, a little bit dangerous from a brain neurobiochemistry point of view, or are we actually causing further sensitization rather than desensitization? So the definition of desensitization would be a stepwise exposure to a trigger, at a distance, reduced intensity, without the dog showing any signs of hyperarousal that causes them to change their mind about certain things. And that can be paired with counter conditioning. So helping the dog feel differently about that by pairing it with something that is really positive. But if that doesn't happen, and if we don't read that moment where desensitization goes over into sensitization, then we're actually just making the problem worse. And then it's going to be even harder to get a positive result in the future. So number one, it's really difficult to understand, the right thresholds, the right distance, the right intensity, reading the body language signs. And the risk, if we get that wrong, is further sensitization rather than desensitization. And then the other big risk for me is, if we continue to expose, is that we flood that animal. And that is something that is used in many training settings. Unfortunately, those group classes where all the dogs are forced to be in one space and are exposed to, other dogs walking around them and told to stay still and behave. And that to me is flooding, right? So it's the exposure to something really scary without a way of naturally coping with it. So employing natural coping strategies to manage that arousal, fear, anxiety, frustration. So, and flooding, as we know, can have really detrimental effects to welfare, because the animal learns no matter what they do, they can't get away from the situation, and they emotionally shut down and go to a place of learned helplessness, which is a really welfare negative thing. So that those to me are the risks, right? Further sensitization and flooding. And obviously the way to that further sensitization is by not really truly understanding desensitization or being able to execute it, I guess, properly. And I think once I start explaining that a little bit, I start to get a little bit of understanding that actually, the more you expose in a not great way, the harder it's going to be that we're ever going to make any progress. Like, we'll be stuck here forever. And I think that sometimes is where, yes, the understanding starts to come in. And then, I guess the final piece of that is, well, then what do we actually do? And is it going to be like this forever? So what that means, my dog's never going to go for a walk ever again. And that's where we then, come in with, well, we need a period of time until we can get our treatment plan in place. Now, that might be with the help of psychopharmacology to help manage some of those fear, anxieties, frustrations, emotional arousal pieces. Or we might, really look at ways of re-regulating the nervous system, and that includes physical health assessment, making sure they're not in pain, making sure they're not in discomfort, allowing that nervous system to kind of settle back down again, and that brain neurobiochemistry to settle back down again, so that we then have an opportunity potentially to allow for processing of the environment for different responses. And that, I think, is the piece that is so vital, is to kind of help the caregivers understand, well, when we do reintroduce, it's probably not going to look the same way as it did before. We're not just going to go out there and be like, woohoo, here's a dog, off we go. Let's see how, whether you're any better now, because that is destined to not succeed. So in the meantime, whilst we have a period of avoidance, and how long that period is depends on every individual case and situation, we want to start seeing if we can help the dog's brain to start processing differently. We want to start seeing if we can help re-regulate the nervous system, get a little bit more resilience, get a bit of control over the nervous system, have some therapeutic plans in place, make sure we've got physical health addressed, make sure we've got diet and nutrition addressed, make sure that we've got, potentially psychopharmacology on board if that's something that we need. And then we start to really think about, how does that patient then experience, or how can we help them to experience the environment and some of these triggers differently? And that, for me, has a lot to do with processing. How can they process? So that means, basically, rather than the brain going directly to the limbic system, to the amygdala, and having that almost short-circuited fight, flight, stress response, is helping the patient to access the cortical areas of their brain where they can process things. And what that looks like, again, depends on each individual. Some dogs prefer to process visually, other dogs prefer to process through smelling and sniffing. Other dogs like to process through movement and by doing things, being active. Pattern games can be a great thing here. So there are so many things that we can then use to start implementing that. And oftentimes, let's say it is that scenario where the dog finds it really stressful to leave the home, and walks can be really challenging. The outside world itself can be really challenging. We find a processing tool that works for that dog, and that could be a snuffle mat, that could be a pattern game, that could be a specific thing that they do, like paws up if it's appropriate, or middle, to help them feel safer in certain contexts. And we start practicing some of these things just with the front door open. So, world watching, it's called in some cases, and there are a million other ways of doing this. I know Shrek Patel's bucket game, or there are a million ways, a million other pattern games that, one dog might prefer over the other. And that's, again, where a really great, trainer or non-veterinary behaviorist can come in and start implementing some of these tools, so that we then have specific strategies that we can use and take on the road. That might be a Zen bed, right? A specific bed or mat or surface that the dog's conditioned to experience physiological relaxation. And we take that with us, and we slowly kind of expose the dog to the world with that kind of safety strategy in place. And, for example, here in Abu Dhabi, there are a lot of apartment buildings, and a lot of dogs find that journey from the door of the apartment building to the lift down to, leaving the apartment building really difficult. So having either some pattern games or a Zen bed or a snuffle mat to kind of take on that journey and help them process their way through can be really, really important. So that would be a little bit my approach to avoidance. And as I've been talking, I've remembered probably another 3 cases just in recent weeks. I'm talking about, obviously, many cases have a portion of this, involved with the treatment plan. But yeah, so many cases we have this conversation about avoiding or not avoiding, and that can be, for all the way from, is it going to be possible, feasible, appropriate, fair for this dog to not have to go on walks at all anymore, all the way through to, well, what do we do when we see a specific trigger? We know that that is the only trigger on a walk that the dog really finds hard to deal with. Could be another dog, could be a bite, could be a car, whatever it is. And what are we going to do in that specific situation? So yeah, and I've chosen obviously the example of walks and things because that just tends to be a really common classic one. But we can also transfer this to other bits and pieces, noise exposures or physical interaction exposure to people, humans, whatever it might be. So yeah, I just wanted to talk about it because it's a tricky, sticky one, but sometimes it can really be the difference between making progress and not making progress. And probably the most crucial piece of this, because if the dog could speak, they probably would tell us exactly, what they thought. But the really crucial piece of this is getting the caregiver buy-in, and that's the hardest part. So, maybe I should have talked a little bit more about how to have those conversations with the caregivers, but it's essentially, I think, providing them with the evidence for why, i.e. sensitization versus desensitization and, neural pathways and brain processes just either being repeated and strengthened in those moments. We all know about long-term potentiation and, how quickly that happens and, what the Hebb's law, what fires together wires together. We all know about those pieces, right? That if certain behavioral patterns are repeated over time, it's going to be really hard to change them going forwards. So I think, having those conversations. Would I bargain with a client? Sometimes if I feel that if I don't bargain with them, I'm going to lose them altogether, maybe. But like I say, over time, I think I've gotten a lot better at really understanding and being able to evidence, by telling stories of other cases or giving other case examples, how things potentially don't get better if we allow things to continue as they are. And I think also sometimes a big part, and again, it's a little bit client dependent, but a big part of it is tapping into the why. Well, why would it be so bad to stop going for walks? And then really understanding where that comes from, that belief system. Is it the guilt? Is it because they truly believe that they're failing their dogs or their pets in this case if they don't take them for a walk? Do they think they're going to be judged by friends and family members, which again is another big piece. People saying, what, you're not taking your dog for a walk? No, but surely every dog needs to go for a walk and they need to socialize with other dogs. That's what every dog needs. So, and that can be hard, right? Those societal pressures, family pressures. So tapping into that a little bit and kind of letting them know, yeah, that's what I hear pretty much from everyone. You're not alone in this, but your dog is different. And if they're clients that have owned dogs or that have had pets, over time, and they've had a number of different pets, and they say to you, this one's just different, then that can sometimes be a good place to tap in and say, look, you're a brilliant pet owner. All of your other dogs have had exactly what you feel, they need. But this particular one is different, and that's got nothing to do with you. That's to do with the dog and the baggage that they potentially have brought with them. And actually, one client that I'm thinking about that came into my mind as I started kind of talking about this, that was exactly the thing for her. She has active working breed dog lines. She's always been really active and busy with them, trained them a lot, daily walks and so on and so forth. And she now has a little doggy that can't leave the front door of the house. And over time, we've had to really sort of manage expectations and help expectations shift and change to help both the dog and her through this and help them understand that actually it is fine. This dog's got a brilliant home setup, really strong social relationships, a brilliant, stable social network, loads of enrichment and needs being met at home. And she's really scared of the outside world. And yes, she gets, brilliant outlets in secure fields that she drives to in the car that she doesn't feel scared of. So sometimes that can be, in my experience, the biggest difference between a positive and not so positive outcome in terms of the caregiver's perception or perspective, is helping manage those expectations and do a lot of education around that. And that, I think, can be the hardest part. But I also just wanted to talk a little bit about what I perceive the risks to be of not avoiding, and how we can maybe set that up in a way that we can reintroduce certain things, maybe not everything, but certain things, in a way that is going to help and that's going to be positive and cause long-lasting behavior change, rather than just quick fixes, right? By using aversive tools or things that we don't want to be using. And funnily enough, sometimes after a period of time, if the client sees that actually the dog is so much happier if they don't have to do these things like go on walks, and actually their lives are so much better because they don't wake up in the morning with the dread of having to take the dog out on the walk, then, even if we got to the point where we're like, right, we're maybe ready to start introducing to the environment now, and they're like, oh no, we're fine. We've decided he doesn't need to go out for walks. He or she's so happy doing this and this and this. We're perfect as we are, and they're perfect as they are. And that to me is like, okay, now we have a successful outcome. All right. I think this was an important topic to talk about because I think it comes up in pretty much every single behavior consult you might do, and just wanted to understand it or explain a little bit my way of thinking behind it. So I hope you found it useful, and I will see you next week in episode 139. Bye for now.